panelists, starting with. Oh, okay.
Let's try to get so that they can, so that they can know who you are there.
Okay, sounds great.
So. One in case, and excellent. Good. Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you very much to White and Case and Peter. Thank you very much for the support of the firm. Dara, thank you very much as well. It's our fourth day of Washington Arbitration Week, and we have the pleasure of one being here, but also talking about one key topic, which are climate change and the environment. And basically, I would like to keep it short for those that might not know me, but my name is Jose Antonio Rivas. I'm co-founder of Washington Arbitration Week, together with Ian Laird. And I would like to introduce our moderator today, Adara Brown. She is an associate in White & Case International Arbitration Group, and she represents and advises private parties in foreign sovereigns in the resolution of international dispute. Her practice focuses on investment treaty and commercial arbitration, as well as public international law. She has represented clients in arbitration before various parties and tribunals under the ICC rules, under ICSID and other rules. She has also represented clients in a variety of pro bono matters, and she graduated with honors from Cornell Law School, where she served as editor for both Journal of Public Policy and the Supreme Court Bulletin. Dara has also worked on matters related to the environment, and hence she is now being a moderator of this panel. And I will let you sort of present our panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, let's try this again. Welcome everyone to the fourth day of Washington Arbitration Week. Thank you for attending our event. Today, we will discuss international arbitration in the era of climate change, renewable energies, geoengineering, and the critical mineral industry. So I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. First off with Dr. Jose Alberto. Dr. Alberto is a senior managing director at FTI Consulting. He has more than 40 years of experience focusing on applied economic and financial modeling in numerous industries, including oil and gas, consumer goods, and telecommunications. Dr. Alberto specializes in damages estimation in international arbitration, mergers, and antitrust, along with economic impact analysis and tariff design in water, electricity, and natural gas industries. He served as an ICSID and ICC arbitrator as well. Next, I'd like to introduce Ken Kratoville. And Ken's right next to me. Ken's a current partner at HKA. He has over 20 years of experience in valuation and forensic accounting. He specializes in damages quantification, valuation, and complex financial modeling. He's been appointed as a testifying expert and assisted the named expert in more than 40 arbitrations involving renewables and mining disputes. Prior to his experience as a testifying expert, he worked for an investment bank in New York and held various corporate finance and regulatory positions at Lockheed Martin and the SEC. Next, we have Mr. Rush, Garrett Rush. He is the managing director at Secretariat. He's spent over the last 2 decades advising clients and providing expertise on critical issues involving valuation, finance, and economics. His work has spanned industries including financial services, telecom, mining, and all aspects of energy. Garrett has been recognized by Who's Legal as technically outstanding and among the very, very best. Prior to joining Secretariat, Mr. Rush worked for a management consulting firm focusing on developing revenue enhancement strategies for private equity-backed companies. And he was educated in both France and the United States. Lastly, we have Peter Platt. Peter is a partner at White & Case. He has more than 20 years of experience as an international law attorney. He specializes in investment treaty arbitration, international commercial arbitration, public international law, and the protection of foreign investments. He has experience working with clients in a number of industries, including mining and mineral processing, electricity generation, supply and distribution, telecommunications, oil and gas, real estate, and sovereign debt, and more. Throughout the last decade, Peter has been recognized by various market research institutions such as Who's Legal as a leader in arbitration. He started off his career in White & Case's Prague office prior to joining its DC office in 2003, and he was educated in both the Czech Republic and United States. I just want to provide a quick roadmap for today's discussion. We'll cover three main topics with a subtopic, let's say. So first, we'll discuss the rise in renewable energy investments and related disputes. Next, we'll turn to the future of renewables. We'll then change topics to the energy transition's impact on critical minerals and base metals. And we'll close out today's session with lessons we can draw from geoengineering. So we'd like to start off with our first topic, which is the rise in renewable energy investments and related disputes. And this first question will go to Ken, but everyone, of course, can opine. So Ken, in 2015, for the first time in history, developing countries reportedly invested more in renewable energy projects than developed economies. Moreover, in 2020, investments in renewable energy projects amounted to a record of $303 billion, which is more than 7 times the figure in 2004. This significant growth in renewable energy investments has an obvious correlation with the rise in renewable energy disputes. What are factors, in your opinion, that are driving these disputes?
Thank you for the great introduction, and thank you to White & Case for hosting us at this important event on climate change. I think a couple of the main factors that are driving some of the increase in disputes is the actual size and the growth of the renewable energies industry. And I think this is a very importantly timed panel here, because as today is the kickoff of the 28th COP meeting in the UAE, that they're going to have 70,000 representatives, over 200 countries talking about climate issues, and that's going towards that growth factor. Just today they were talking about how the highest record climate is in the U.S. in the world in 2023, and currently we're at about 1.4 degrees Celsius above the levels from pre-industrial time. And everybody knows, I think the goals from the Paris Accords have been to keep it around 1.5 to 2 by the end of the century. Some of the information that came out, showed that we're not really on a track towards that path. Currently estimated about 2 degrees to 2.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And it's a lot better than it was estimated back in 2010, which was at 3.5 degrees. But it doesn't sound like a lot when you're going from 1.4 to 2.5, but really you're talking about an 80% increase. So that increase in the carbon emissions is driving the growth towards the actual increase in the number of renewable projects that are needed. But it's not enough currently. The plans that the COP has are to build climate resistant societies, which we know that climate change is actually already occurring. So we need to build communities that are ready for those situations. We need to move off of fossil fuels, some predict by 2050 to actually reach some of our net zero goals, so that we're not at levels, at the end of the century that aren't in line with our current climate estimates. But the main area, which is then towards that size, is the investment. And the COP28 is talking about that we need to inspire commitments into the investments into environmental and positive projects and practices. So as you mentioned, the size of the growth is now at $300 billion in renewable energy projects, which is massive amounts higher than it was in the 10 years prior to 2020. So 2010 to 2019, it moderated around 250 billion. And before that, in the early 2000s, it was significantly lower at around 50 billion or less. So there was a huge growth in the early 2000s, plateaued around 2010 to 2020. Now we're in another growth phase, basically, where that increase from 2020 of 300 billion is now at 500 billion, so $500 billion. But is that enough? Is that what we're talking about as being enough? The experts would say no. Currently, the plans that we have in place are to reduce carbon emissions by about 1/8 of the amount that we need to reduce by 2030. And some estimates say that to actually reach the levels that we would need to, we would actually have to double or potentially even triple the level of the investment. So we're talking about a massive amount of investment in a relatively shorter period of time. So that increase in the size and the increase in the time period when it actually need to occur is obviously going to create issues that will end up leading towards potentially additional disputes. The funding gap as well right now on just the plans, not to actually do any type of abatement, but actually the plans that are already in place to meet our current plans is actually 250 billion underfunded every year. So there's a lot of investment that's going to be coming, that needs to be coming. I think that in itself has led to a lot of disputes and will continue to lead to a number of disputes into the future.
Great, thank you so much, Ken. Garrett, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, of course. I knew that Ken would be addressing this question, and I was reading the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, and this chart was in there, and I couldn't help but include it. It was in a feel-good story about how much investment is going into solar, higher than it had been originally expected, wind power, and global stock of battery electric vehicles. And so it might be hard for you to see, but there's three things I took from these graphs. One is the darker line is the actual investment in capacity. And then you can see that extends with the 2023 forecast, and it's quite vertical and accelerating. But then you can see really kind of the point of these charts was from 2002, 2010, and intervening years, there have been a number of projections, and all of those have been under projected. So there has been actually a higher than expected investment in solar, wind power capacity, and vehicle batteries. And the reason for this really is because at the time in 2009, we did not expect the cost of solar to go down so much. And right now it's about 10% of what it was in 2009, which makes solar actually the most economic, along with wind power, of any of the sources of power, well below some of the traditional fossil fuels. And so that's really the story here. But kind of taking that over to the disputes world, we think about, well, what creates a fertile environment for disputes? And the first factor is size of investment, right? So we have the size of investment, massive investment. We have massive expected investment needed. We also have changing technology. So of course that creates lots of friction. And then we have government intervention, government involvement. So the perfect recipe for international arbitration. Just looking back though, what can we glean from the last few years and this period leading up to 2023? And so this shows really kind of one story in my mind, which is the Spanish solar story, right? So you see on the left, you can see the number of renewable energy awards that have come out. It's dominated by solar. On the right, you can see most of those are coming from West and East Europe. And of those, most of those are coming from Spain. So why, what created the Spain disputes? Well, it was because the cost of solar was so high that Spain offered attractive incentives to draw investors in. Those incentives included, according to the investors, the promise of fixed tariffs. According to Spain, it was the promise of a reasonable rate of return. All of these disputes have kind of had a few different debates, particularly on the quantum side. But really the big debate that has differentiated the awards is whether the tribunal has gone with a reasonable return approach or has gone with a fixed tariff approach. And it's almost 50-50. It's leaning a little bit towards the fixed tariff right now. There's still a few awards left to come out. But that is the kind of the debate and then the resolution looking backwards. But you're not going to see that same debate going forward, right? Because there is no need for the fixed tariff going forward, the incentives going forward, or at least the same incentives that we saw in the past.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you so much, Garrett. Jose, do you have anything to add?
Very little. A couple points. One, that the amount of subsidies that governments have been giving investors did grow up quite fast, starting in 2015, but they have started to grow slower and to taper off. One of the reasons probably is each country is subjected to its own political cycles. But certainly the increase in the price of other forms of energy, and particularly of gas, the fact that natural gas has been going up very fast because of the war in Ukraine, must be one of the determinants of this relative disengagement of governments. That's one point. And the other point, which we'll probably talk a little more as we go forward, is that I agree that the Spanish lesson has taught everyone involved that they should be very careful as to what the government actually promises to investors, but that this increase in, particularly in investments in electricity, are creating network effects that, because of the fact that the electricity, as we all know, generation and consumption is highly dependent on the specific form of the grid, of the network. These new sources of generation that are springing around are changing the dynamic of the grid, and that is bringing a new generation of claims that are indirectly connected to these changes.
Great, thank you so much, Jose. Peter, did you have any final words on this question?
Sure, a couple of things, and I will present my comments from an investment treaty perspective. So there have been, as we know, a great number of cases relating to renewable energy sources before investment treaty tribunals. Specifically, according to the Energy Charter Secretariat, which published its statistics this May, out of the 158 known cases under the Energy Charter Treaty, 59% related to renewable power generation. That comes to about 93.3 cases, something like that. It's not a round number, but almost 100 cases. UNCTAD, which also publishes statistics on investment treaty arbitration, identified about 1,250 investment treaty cases to date, and at least 8%, according to UNCTAD, out of these related to the reduction of clean energy invested. So again, a very significant number. So going back to the question, what is the driver of these cases? In short, It is reduction to incentives that states have provided to producers of solar electricity in particular, or to producers of renewable energy sources. And let me just outline the developments in EU countries such as Spain and Italy to illustrate. The European Union issued or adopted directives in 2001 and 2009, setting forth renewable energy targets for its member states in terms of how much energy needs to be produced and consumed out of renewable sources. It left it to the individual member states to implement how to achieve those targets. And so some countries such as Italy and Spain adopted regimes that gave incentives to producers of solar power, for example, in the form of above market prices, feed-in tariffs, with the goal of stimulating private investment in that area and the building up of the renewable power sector. But after those regimes were put in place, the prices of the technology dropped significantly. This was in the early 2010s. And that was because technologically it became cheaper to manufacture solar panels, for example, in China, and suddenly it became much cheaper to install these power plants than it was at the time when these regulatory regimes were adopted. And so this created a gap where there was a lot of influx of investment into these power plants, as investors were seeking to capitalize on the difference between the subsidized prices, subsidized revenues, and the costs that they were incurring in real life. That was one point. The other point was that many countries found themselves in a situation where the governments perceived the regime as being just too expensive, either because money was running out in terms of funding these subsidized prices, or because politically it was difficult to be transferring on the extra charge to end consumers who ultimately would have to pay. And so basically these regimes were rolled back. The investors who spent money when the original incentive regimes were in place felt that this was unfair to them and started investment treaty cases where they had investment treaty protections. And that's why we see this many arbitrations relating to the solar sector in particular. I would say, just in terms of the jurisprudence that has emerged from these cases, a lot of the awards focus on the interaction of investor expectations and the state's right to regulate, as we know. And the outcomes are not consistent from case to case, even sometimes with respect to the same country. I would say, though, that one common theme is that the tribunals first focus on what exactly are the rights that the investor had under the domestic regime that was in place. That's really like a key element. And I would caution, if you are reviewing these cases, to always keep that in mind. These decisions are driven in large part by that and by the specifics of the particular incentive regimes that were in place under the national laws as much as anything else. And in particular, going back to what Garrett said, the tribunals focus on whether the investors were guaranteed a certain price for a certain duration, irrespective of what the costs are. If that's the case, then it would imply that the investor is entitled to keep the delta, no matter how low the costs are, or whether the regimes were designed to only provide to the investors a reasonable return as measured, for example, by an hypothetical efficient plant or on an efficient cost basis. That's and you will see a split in the jurisprudence. This is an important factor that drives a lot of the divergent outcomes. And the other common element in these cases is that once the tribunal decides what the original regime looked like, what rights it conveyed to the investors, then in terms of liability, the tribunals focus on how severe or what is the magnitude of the changes that followed later on, either with respect to what the original regime looked like or with respect to the impacts on the investors. I will stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. You've all just described the factors driving the recent surge in renewable energy investments and related disputes. Can you briefly opine on where you see things going in the future? And we'll start off again with you, Ken.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'm going to break it down into two parts because I think the rest of it will be covered by the rest of the panelists. But you've got the short-term future and you've got the long-term future. So I'll take a look at what the short-term future potentially could look like. And I'll just start by talking about what's happening recently. I've been talking about a lot of the growth. A lot of people have been talking about what's needed. We know what's needed, but there's been a little bit of a change in landscape, particularly recently. And 2023, anybody who follows the markets knows that renewable energies by market cap have taken some of the biggest beatings that they've had in the last decade. The companies that are out there that are public aren't either making as much or it's being a harder environment. And people can say that it's two different things. Obviously, the rise in inflation has caused problems for many different companies, many different industries, and renewable energies is obviously one of those industries that's taking a big hit. If these companies that are going into these long-term projects are set up where they've got two different sides of their equation, where maybe their revenue side is maybe a fixed stream that we're talking about in some of these situations, but they haven't really thought about the cost side of things. With the inflation actually hitting them, the margins are getting squeezed and they're not able to actually continue to make profit or continue to operate in some situations. That's a real problem for some of the investors, and it's causing a lot of concern in the environment. The same thing, is said around interest rates. So interest rates have been increasing as inflation has been increasing as well. And we've heard the mantra that interest rates are going to be staying higher for longer. Well, if you entered into a long-term contract as an investor where you didn't set up your financing to actually be recuperated by your operations for whatever reason, or if you had it for a longer duration than the term of the project or a shorter duration, you would actually have to be refinancing right now. So those extra costs of having to refinance at rates that are much, much higher for projects that cost potentially a lot more than was expected, also again squeezes some of those margins. So there's a lot of situations that are causing turmoil in the markets. The investors are concerned about the longevity of some of their investments that they've already made, and they're not sure how long the situations are currently going to last, how long the inflation is going to be this high, how long the interest rates are going to actually be this high, and if it's actually going to change in a term in the short term, that's actually going to turn things around. You can see by the stock market, it hasn't. And to be fair, these stocks had really high rallies from the 2000s until maybe 2022. So there's been a bit of a pullback. Some people estimate about 30%, 40% from where they were. A lot of stocks that are high flyers had come back, but those additional costs, are something that is going to potentially drive disputes because the investors are now sitting in situations where they're in unprofitable situations and they're trying to figure out a way to get out of something. With all the government, and we're talking about, some people will talk about a little bit more, all the government incentives as well. Companies are getting billions and billions of dollars in tax incentives, tariff reductions, and the renewable energy sector is still struggling with those situations. So how long can those benefits continue to last, both to the customers and to the companies? A lot of the tariffs, and the benefits that are going to the electrical vehicle market, for governments. Well, China has just been renewed until 2025, so that's a $72 billion investment right there. How long can those be sustained? That's another area of turmoil that's going to probably cause additional disputes. But overall, I think in the short term, the amount of risk and the risk appetite of people is going to get questions if it hasn't already been. So some of the investments in the short term are likely going to be harder to actually come by because people are going to be a little more risk adverse. And that's not necessarily a sign that there's actually going to be less disputes, because again, if you're in a situation where you have a concession and you're actually supposed to perform on something by a certain period of time, putting in a certain amount of investment to actually produce, and you can't do it now because you don't have the financing or you can't afford to make a profit. So you hold off for 2 or 3 or 4 years. Are you going to actually be allowed to keep that? Again, legal issues that will definitely be considered, again, creating more potential disputes.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken. Jose, I'll lead things to you. Where do you see things going in the future?
I agree with Ken that there's going to be an increasing number of disputes. They will, just because the drivers are still there. As he said, this continues to be a very risky area. There's parts of the risk involved in these activities that hasn't been fully exhibited. The relationship between investors and governments is not totally settled. And I think that to come back to my previous comment and expand on it, we are going to start seeing what I would call kind of the indirect effects of these investments in renewables, not the ones that are directly connected with the establishment of plants, either solar or wind. But those that have to do, for example, with the behavior of the network. In the understanding that the way the network behaves may have a very important impact on the profitability of the investors. But there's other considerations. For many countries, and it's the case in Latin America and in other parts of the world, governments still own either the only generating company in the country, or at least have an incumbent. And that brings issues that have to do with the dispatching of how is the electricity fed into the network. Mexico is, to be diplomatic, experimenting with that by changing all of the rules it had established some years ago as to how the electricity is dispatched. And given the clear difference between generating electricity, particularly at some periods of the year of the day, with wind and solar, or generating it with hydrocarbons, the profitability of the incumbent company is a function of the dispatching rules. So there's an attack on dispatching rules. This is the type of kind of indirect effects I was talking about. And one thing that I find extremely interesting is that the issue remains as to how do you measure the damage or the alleged damage done to the investor, whether it is with more, I would call them traditional DCF methods, or as was mentioned before, considerations about the profitability of the investments, for example, with calculations of the IRR in comparison with some benchmarks. So in that sense, I think we're going to see a lot more cases, probably different from the ones that we've seen in Spain, and they will bring to the fore discussions about some parameters that have been hidden in most of our discussions about valuation.
Great, thank you so much, Jose. Garrett, what can we expect in the next decade in terms of renewables?
Yeah, so I think I agree with what Jose was saying, so I'll keep it brief. But I think if you think about, what are legitimate expectations right now, we expect continued solar, we expect continued wind. And what does that do to the profile of generating capacity? Well, an increasing percentage is going to renewables. And what's unique about renewables is they're a little more unpredictable than the hydrocarbon sources, right? So Jose touched on this, but a big area of investment that has to take place is in electricity grids, right? Electricity grids that can accommodate and reach all of these different plants. The other area that is consistent with this new profile of our energy source is energy storage, right? We talk a lot about energy storage. I think we're getting close to, large scale energy storage for electricity grids. And then the last piece that has to take place, and I'm sure this is going to come out of COP28, and it's going to create lots of issues in the next couple of decades, is carbon capture. So people talk a lot about carbon capture, but there hasn't been a lot of initiative around it, both in taxing it and then also the technology to implement. They're just the incentives on a global scale do not exist yet. And at the same time, we need to implement carbon capture to reach the goals that basically the world has to reduce carbon emissions.
Great. Thank you so much, Garrett. Peter?
Thank you. Just a couple of quick points. So the renewable energy industry and renewable power production in particular, I think has some systemic features that just make it particularly susceptible to political risk and conducive to investment treaty disputes. And that's because there is a large outlay of capital at the beginning. Those projects have a very long duration. They rely on government incentives or they rely on regulatory regimes that governments put in place. And the lifespan of these projects far outlives the duration of any particular government. So these factors are not going to go away. They will always be there. I think the industry will be always facing these issues. And what that will mean also in light of the jurisprudence that is emerging under investment treaties with some very sizable awards in favor of investors, is that investors will continue to seek the protection of investment treaties and try to structure themselves in a way that will bring them protection under those treaties. And I think it will be interesting to see how that evolves in the future, because there has been a lot of pushback against investment treaties recently. A number of states have renegotiated them or terminated them. The European Union has phased them out, or so the European Commission thinks within the European Union. And so I think we will see a lot of maybe more sophisticated investment treaty structuring by future investors seeking to thread a way through the remaining treaties that are still out there to get some meaningful protections. Another point I wanted to mention is if investment treaties are terminated and disappear at some point in the future, hypothetically, I think that will not be actually the end of a quasi-investor state arbitration dispute resolution, because what will happen is that we might revert back to the situation that existed before investment treaties, when the more powerful investors, when investing in developing countries in particular, are able to get an investment contract with the government that has an arbitration clause and some applicable law that is not the law of the host state. So I think some form of investor state resolution in this area is here to stay. Question, I think, is whether the smaller investors who do not have that power to negotiate a special deal with a host government will be left out if investment treaties are not there anymore.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. Moving on to our next topic, critical minerals and base metal product disputes. I'll start off with you, Garrett. The energy transition has also come at a significant cost, and the direct impacts are manifesting within the global supply of critical minerals. What are some key takeaways with respect to the energy transition's impact on critical minerals and base metals?
So extractive industries have always made up a big part of the cases in the ICSID caseload. So I think most recently it's been about 25%. I think that's consistent with the past trends. You can see here, this is a graph of the demand for materials. And so they include plastics and building materials and metals in this. And this is a McKinsey graph. You can see there's sort of a couple lessons. One, there's been a significant increase over the 2000 to 2022 period. It's also quite volatile, right? These are nominal, they use nominal prices in this. So you can see the effect of price swings is shown in this chart. So it's the swings quite a bit. I think, we think of renewables as creating a dematerialized world. Well, in fact, this transition has increased the use of materials, and necessarily so, right? In order to create the structures we need for renewable energy, we actually need to expend and use more materials, and that's part of what this chart shows. And then, I think we're familiar with things like lithium. Materials like lithium are in the headlines every day with the just massive increase in demand that's both necessary, and then there's always concerns that the supply won't be enough, right? And you can see lithium shows up on the far left of this graph, where the light blue shows the portion of the demand related to renewable energy. And so lithium's basically at the top of that chart, even though it's on the far left. But I think what's also interesting about this chart is things like materials like copper and aluminum have a significant portion of demand that's coming from the renewable sector. And so when we go back to international arbitration, we think, well, 25% of arbitrations were related to extractives, but this is a whole new source of disputes, right? This is new supply coming online. And it adds to what I consider kind of the historic bases for disputes, right? In the extractive industry. Things like commodity price volatility, right? The prices of metals like gold and copper have always swung quite dramatically. And I was just looking at a graph before this, and just thinking about how our industry, lawyers and consultants would act if, our prices, our fees swung as much as some of these commodities, right? So, copper was just over $2 in 2020, and then it more than doubled by 2021. And then it was down 25% in 2022, and then up 30% in 2023. I mean, you can imagine what that does to an industry if you think about what that would do to our own work, right? It creates a lot of instability and a lot of behavioral distortions. And that's part of why we see a lot of disputes coming out of extractives. Regulatory risk and government interventions have always been part of extractive industries. A typical mine takes about 10 to 15 years to develop. That's a long period of exposure to potentially multiple different political parties or regimes in countries. And so there's a lot of exposure to risk over that period. Environmental and social considerations. I personally haven't been involved in a case yet where there haven't been some environmental or social considerations as part of the case and the dispute. And of course, risk and capital. And these projects are the poster child for risk, right? They have the price volatility I talked about, but significant upfront capital expenditures and a very long life in order to recover that capital expenditure. So the profile makes them almost perfect for international disputes.
Great. Thank you so much, Garrett. Ken, how would you describe some key takeaways with respect to the impacts of the energy transition on critical minerals and base metals?
Well, I mean, to start off, I would agree with Garrett was talking about, there's definitely an increase in the amount of minerals that are coming online and being necessary to drive a lot of the renewable energies and the technologies that we're going to need to actually decrease the level of carbon emissions in the future. Going back to some of the things that you talked about at the very beginning as well, some of the investments, 300 billion last or 2020, with the majority of that coming from developing countries. A lot of these minerals are actually in areas where the countries are developing countries. So you've got, the elements that we're talking about here. You've got the growth, you've got the necessary of new materials, and then you've also got them being in countries that are still developing. And all these minerals aren't necessary just for electric vehicles, but it's been obviously one of the bigger drivers as well. We talked about some of the electricity storage, even wind turbines, a lot take carbon or copper. So there's been huge demands in those areas, but the amount of lithium has increased significantly. And from this graph, you can see that countries like the U.S., but all around, are determining what are the critical minerals that they need for their economy, and also then classifying them for national security issues. So the U.S. came out with 50 new minerals that they defined as critical in 2022, and they base it on what is the importance for their energy security and also then the supply risk. And you can see that at the top right corner in the red is that lithium, which Garrett was mentioning. It has the most importance, and it also has a large supply risk. Of course, a lot of the lithium comes from the lithium triangle down in Latin America. A lot of it's currently still under development, and coming from those areas, there's a high importance. But then, similar to, I think, some of the other issues that you probably heard in some of the other panels, and we've talked about here, is those price volatilities with those spikes. So the lithium price is similar to some of the copper, but maybe to a higher degree, had spiked, recently. And that's to say, electric vehicle batteries has actually gone down in prices significantly. Same thing with solar panels over the last decade. The costs have actually gone down significantly, but there are increases in specific materials that are created by some of these shocks, and additional government incentives that were put in 2020, 21, 22 have actually accelerated some of the growth in the lithium areas, but then they've actually obviously declined. That shock is then creating ripples throughout then the market where there's not as much investment going into developing these mines as was discussed. It takes 10 to 15 years. But it's not just about those rare earth metals. It's also about some of the other areas, and that copper base is one of the bigger areas that highlight the price fluctuation, because people haven't figured out exactly how the technology will be used. Sometimes they're coming out with situations where copper is a very heavy metal, lithium is lighter. So can we use more lithium and less copper in some of the batteries? It actually then increases and decreases some of those supply shifts that are needed into the future, and some of the development then that's impacting some of these needs. But going back to some of the issues that we're talking about, 18 million tons of new minerals that are going to be needed by 2030. So just adding on to some of the comments, obviously I was talking about lithium, but the copper increases as well. The most amount of the copper is actually currently being mined in Chile. That's not to say that they have the most deposits, but they have, again, a large supply of lithium. They're one of the lithium triangles, and then also have massive amounts of copper. So the mines that are actually in operation in Chile are very important, and copper was added to the strategic minerals to the United States in their 2022 list of the 50 top that they need. So this is a graph that was created by CRA, which reports on the Latin American, it reports on the amounts of copper treaty cases based on the prices. So we're talking about some of the price fluctuations, some of the things that create disputes. You can kind of see here that there's some correlation. I wouldn't say perfect, but you've got some areas of issue where, and these are in constant dollars, not nominal dollars for the price values. So you're going back to all the way back to 1999, where when the price spikes of certain minerals such as copper, you see a high level of the disputes. So I think as we're seeing these additional minerals that are being mined, additional supply shocks because of reductions in export restrictions, that just happened recently. One of the minerals that was listed in that first slide with the cars is graphite. And graphite is not a very expensive mineral, but it's the largest component. It's actually used in electric vehicle batteries. And soon after the United States restricted the amount of technology chips that could be exported to China, China imposed a restriction on the amount of battery quality graphite that could actually be exported. So you've seen some of those issues that are already starting to creep in. Going back to some of the lithium issues, this is just showing that it's actually already started. The number of cases that are starting up in the lithium dispute area are only going to increase. And I've only highlighted a couple here. The first one is in Chile, the Simcoe versus the Republic of Chile hasn't been filed yet. They've threatened it. This is related to basically the rights to a mining concession. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Chen Mining versus AVZ, this is a long running dispute with 6 parallel cases. And it's around the actual ownership, because the ownership of some of these structures are very, very complicated. So you've got a rights issue, you've got an ownership issue, and the last issue with Jinzhou versus Lipco, it's a Chinese-based company that's filed an arbitration in connection to an offtake agreement. So you've got now a contract, issue basically on some of these cases. So you've got issues across all spectrums of the legal areas that are ripe for dispute resolutions.
Great, thank you so much, Ken. Jose, do you have anything to add here?
Sorry, I'd like to go back to the issue of ESG, because again, it seems to me that this is an area where the problem per se has been considered for quite a while. These are considerations that have been made for mines that produce gold and that produce copper in Latin America and in Africa. The issue of ESG is not new, or is not intrinsic to the rare materials that needed to be mined for these renewable projects. But the way those were treated in the past was that people talked about a social license, and they tried to model it by either increasing the cost or by increasing the cost of equity, and thus the WACC. And that's the way they would try to incorporate this issue into the actual valuation of the damage. What I think is different in these renewable cases, and it's connected to one of the issues that was talked about before, is this notion of legitimate expectations. And the same way one could argue that maybe 20 years ago it wasn't obvious that the sovereign would change its regulatory framework to take into account what was happening in that country. But now, after 20 years experience, a savvy investor today should incorporate that in the way it calculates its profitability. I think the notion of legitimate expectations is changing through time, and considerations with respect to ESG that may not have been very prominent 20 years ago are considerably important now, particularly in the renewables area. And that has something directly to do with the way we estimate damage. Doing it, we go back to the notion that using DCF type methods to estimate may not be as appropriate as using the notion of a legitimate return and internal rates of return. So I'm being repetitive, but I think there's a shift in the way us valuators are going to have to do our work, and that shift is important. And it's attributable to the characteristics, some specific characteristics of the renewable sector.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jose. Peter, do you have anything to say to close out this topic?
Yes, so to react to some of the points that were made just briefly, I do agree that the critical mineral industry has all the elements of future disputes. I think we all see that, and in fact, I think it's already happening. Just one example comes to mind. Mexico took steps to nationalize the lithium sector not too long ago. There already are cases against Mexico involving lithium. I think this is just an example of what to expect in the future. Following up on Ken's point about graphite, that I think is actually a very interesting thing that might be specific to critical minerals in a way, and that is that some countries might be using their natural resources of critical minerals as a foreign policy tool. And that's the example of China in particular, where, as Ken mentioned, the United States has restricted export of artificial intelligence chips to China. And within days, China announced export controls on graphite, of which it is the largest producer. Reportedly, those export controls, I think, are actually going into effect tomorrow. So we'll see what impact that has on the supply of graphite to the United States. But that's a very important element in the mix. You saw the picture with the car, where 66.3 kilograms of what goes into it was graphite. So I think that will be one interesting future aspect to see whether investors will end up being caught in the middle of this dynamic of states using their resources of critical minerals as a foreign policy tool. And in terms of the future, let's say, legal issues that will be addressed by future tribunals, I think environmental and social governance that Jose mentioned definitely today is one of the big issues in these cases, and will continue to be the case. So I think, again, for investors from forward-looking perspective, again, we will see something similar as we might expect in the renewable energy space, and that is that investors will look very hard at existing treaties, think about how those may evolve and structure themselves in a way that they will gain protections, not only as these treaties exist today, but also with respect to what might happen in the future. So, for example, if you see that a particular country is rethinking its investment treaty program and is thinking about pulling that back, you wouldn't want to be protected only by that country's investment treaties. Obviously, you would be looking for other places and to channel your investment.
Thank you so much, Peter. Moving on to our final topic of geoengineering. Peter, back to you.
Okay, so just to introduce the topic by way of background, what is geoengineering? It refers to large-scale manipulation of the Earth's natural systems to counter climate change. And it is primarily discussed in connection with three things. One is solar radiation management, and that involves reflecting some of the solar radiation back into space as a way to control climate change. The second is the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and either storing it or reusing it, carbon capture. And the third is weather modification. Now, at the large scale and standalone basis, which is what is understood mostly when by the term geoengineering. None of these things are really happening today. They are at the stage of scientific research, and that research points to significant unknown risks as of today. So we don't, the discussion that we will be having is somewhat theoretical in that geoengineering in the true sense of the word really is not happening today. But carbon capture already is underway as an attachment to existing industrial processes and power generation. And so, for example, according to the International Energy Agency, there already are about 40 existing operating carbon capture facilities attached to various industrial plants and processes around the world today. And this is a booming area. There are literally hundreds, again, more than 500, according to the agency, projects that are being developed right now or being planned for carbon capture. So this is a new industry that is coming up, worth keeping an eye out for. We shall see whether it evolves along the lines of what we've seen, for example, with renewable power generation. In terms of the international treaty framework related to geoengineering, there really isn't any multilateral treaty regime at this point that would address geoengineering specifically or expressly, though some commentators have observed that geoengineering actually might be incompatible with existing multilateral environmental treaties, such as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. And that is because geoengineering might create incentives against reducing emissions. So for example, when it comes to carbon capture, although it does remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, according to those commentators, it might create an incentive against reducing emissions and therefore ultimately defeat the purpose of achieving climate targets. If you are interested in reading more about this, Philippe Sands and Kate Cook published an opinion on this in 2021, which is easily found online if you Google it. It's an interesting read. There also would be implications under human rights instruments with respect to geoengineering. This is another area where there would be tension. When it comes to government policies concerning geoengineering, interestingly, the United States government has released a White House report on June 30th of this year, addressing specifically solar radiation management. And it says that whereas the United States government at this point does not have plans to conduct a comprehensive research of solar radiation management techniques, it is an area that might be developed in the future, and the report goes through the pros and cons and the various ways that solar radiation modification might be researched and developed. So it's very interesting to see that the US government is focusing specifically on this. The European Commission, for its part, issued a statement around the same time, June 28th of this year, in which it said that it does not consider geoengineering to be the solution to climate change because it does not address the root problem, and that is the increase of global greenhouse gas emissions. What lessons can we draw from the discussion we had about renewable energy and mining cases for geoengineering if it does go forward? One thing, if states actually move forward with geoengineering and do it in a similar way as they did for renewables, meaning that they will adopt incentives or regulatory regimes that will seek to bring private investment into this area and maybe build standalone carbon capture plants. Maybe one could envision a system where you generate carbon capture credits that you can then sell on to other businesses, for example, or tax incentives provided to carbon capture facilities, that sort of thing. Then I think we have a similar dynamic where you have a lot of capital spent at the beginning. Your profits ultimately depend on what the government gives you. It's a very long-term investment. And so again, this would be a fertile area for investor-state disputes. Another possibility might be that these activities, meaning geoengineering, go wrong and cause adverse impacts, let's say in an area of the state that has permitted them or that has carried them out. And so one can envision, for example, a scenario where a solar management measure is implemented. It is very effective, but what it does at the same time is it reduces the solar irradiation of solar plants that exist in that country's territory, and investors in those plants might have theoretically investment treaty claims against the government for allowing something that has led to a reduction of the efficiency of those solar plants. And again, like all of this, I think where it leads us is that to the extent that this industry develops further, as it is already, sort of beginning to, with respect to carbon capture, those investors, I think, would be well advised to consider availing themselves of investment treaty protections.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. I think that we may have time for one or two quick questions from the audience, if anyone has questions. Thank you so much.